After the war ended with the passage of the contentious 13th Amendment in 1865, which freed all men, women, and children of color from servitude across the United States, the 14th and 15th Amendments followed suit over the next 5 years. The 14th Amendment was the law which granted all naturalized people of color citizenship in the U.S. The 14th Amendment was passed easily due to the fact that Southern Democrats had no vote in Congress at this time. This passage was before the rebellious states had rejoined the Union, so ratifying the 14th Amendment had become one of the guidelines for being accepted back in. The 15th Amendment was passed in 1870, guaranteeing all black men the right to vote. This was extremely monumental, yet also quite trivial when put to actual use. Many southern states made this amendment negligible by releasing things called black codes. Black codes differed from state to state in the South, but prevented black Americans from becoming fully independent all the same. The black codes consisted of taxes and contracts and rules which prevented African Americans from voting, such as the grandfather clause, the literacy taxes, and literacy tests, and poll taxes. The Republicans in Congress attempted to overturn the Black Codes with the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This act was vetoed by President Johnson, but then overturned by 2/3 of Congress, the first time this had ever happened in history. However, 8 years later, this overturned veto would be outlawed by the Supreme Court on the grounds that it was unconstitutional for Congress to control human norms in states, and this rule would not be changed until 1964 with the Civil Rights Act.
After the war, newly freed African Americans and poor whites were confused and searching for a new way of life. Northerners wanted to stop any return to servitude by providing this lower class with resources and an action plan. Out of this came the Freedmen's Bureau. In March 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau was passed by Congress and made food, shelter, and medical aid available to anyone in turmoil from the destruction of the South. The Bureau went as far as claiming confiscated land for the freed slaves and homeless whites to build communities, as well as build almost 3,000 schools. However, these efforts were not successful in preventing continued prejudicial customs and institutions. In the beginning, landowners tricked many newly freed blacks into contracts that forced unlimited labor. This system evolved under the law into a slightly more lenient work contract. Sharecropping became common and involved a landowner providing necessary farm materials in return for part of the profit. Similar to indentured servitude, sharecropping usually became a system that made the workforce dependent on the landowner. Widespread discrimination towards blacks and any northerners in support of their freedom was also showing in everyday life in radical movements. Northerners that traveled south were called carpetbaggers and most always strongly disliked. Carpetbaggers included anyone traveling south for economic, civil rights, or personal benefits. Southerners that supported integration into Republican society were called scalawags and were many times threatened by Southern Democrats. One major group that had political and social influence was the Ku Klux Klan, or commonly known as the KKK. These were secret societies held to intimidate blacks and defenders of such from gaining or using all new rights. Groups like this burned houses and beat innocent people, all while oftentimes holding power in office. Effects of the KKK are seen throughout history and even today.
Rishi. I'm here to talk about Lincoln, who was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth on April 14, 1865 in Ford Theater during the play Our American Cousin. The weapon seemed to be a Philadelphia Derringer pistol. During this time, the 13th and 14th Amendments were passed, and Lincoln was putting in play his plan for Reconstruction during his second term of his presidency.
I'm here with President Rutherford and Samuel Tilden. Mr. Tilden, how do you feel about losing this election?
It's rigged. Everything's rigged, but it's fine. I'm fine. It's going to be fine.
President Hayes, how do you feel about... do you think you fairly won the election?
Yes, Rishi, I do. There's a reason why the Electoral College is in place. It's the fairest factor in deciding the population. And just because Tilden won the majority of the votes does not mean that he deserves to become president.
Mr. Tilden, do you think the resolutions passed to resolve this controversy, which, if I'm correct, are to remove federal troops in the South, establish the home rule in which the government would stop interfering with the South's local affairs, and which allowed the South to have things such as black codes and prevent African Americans from voting, were fair to both you and the American public?
Well, Rishi, I'm happy these things passed in light of me losing the unfair election. But a compromise is a compromise, which means everyone loses something. For me, I lost the election, but I was going to pass these things anyways.
Thank you for your time.
Good evening. I'm Vanessa Haak. I'm here with President Andrew Johnson discussing his presidency. Now, looking back in history, you're seen as one of the worst presidents of all time. Do you agree with that sentiment?
Okay, well, maybe they did try to impeach me, but they didn't. And yes, I purposely did screw up Lincoln's plan to properly reconstruct the country. But can you blame me? The South shouldn't have left the Union in the first place. Plus, Lincoln was going to give blacks a hand in Reconstruction. That's just ridiculous.
Well, the country certainly has been better off since African Americans have been given the rights they deserve. We've even had a black president.
What?
So was Reconstruction successful?
Well, partly because laws like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were allowed to pass.
But no, because racism persisted and that black codes were enforced and the KKK formed.
Also no, because sharecropping, substituted slavery, and land remain in the hands of the elite.